Hello, my name's Justin Says, and this is the Brussels Signal studio. We're going to be talking about the US election results, and we have online Gabriel Elefteriu, who is Deputy Director of the Council on Geo-strategy, which is London-based. He's also a Brussels Signal correspondent. Hi there, Gabriel.
Hi, Justin.
So, my first question is, what does President Trump mean for Europe? And the first thing that comes to mind, to everyone's mind, I think, is Ukraine. Trump has talked about ending the war. In fact, I think he's boasted about how he could end the war, come to some kind of deal very quickly, even within weeks. Is this realistic, and what kind of deal could he strike?
So, first of all, Trump, I think, is a reality check for Europe. Very much a cold shower for a lot of people who are part of the European strategic community and, let's say, foreign policy elite, who almost thought it inconceivable that Trump could return to office. And we now see their reactions to Trump's re-election their reactions being in very panic-stricken tones, and that is because they haven't actually thought through what his arrival for a second tour of duty in the White House actually means for Europe, and what it means. And I've written about this in Brussels Signal, as you know, and our viewers could check out some of those articles. What this means is a stronger turn towards realpolitik in American foreign policy, I think, under Trump. In terms of Ukraine, yes, he will pursue a deal. He will try to get a deal over the conflict to bring it to a stop, to bring the fighting to a stop, and have some kind of settlement. He's never personally said what the plan is. So anyone who tells you that they know how Trump will do this or how he intends to do it, they're lying, because he's never actually explained how he would do it. But we can speculate. We know what his way of conducting himself in foreign affairs is, which is to try to create leverage and to use, especially to use economics to his advantage, and to try to negotiate hard. Well, in this situation with Ukraine, one thing that he can do, and what some of his advisors have already talked about, is that he might actually threaten to escalate help for Ukraine, assistance to Ukraine, precisely to give, Ukraine side, his side, the West side, an advantage in these negotiations. It won't happen overnight. In one of my recent pieces for Brussels Signal, I raised the question of how do you actually stop the Russians? The Russian army is on the offensive. They're being very successful, unfortunately, on the front in Ukraine. And while they are advancing and while they've got the momentum and the military initiative, it is very hard to bring them to the negotiating table. And unfortunately, the situation has already aggravated quite a lot on the front lines in the Donbass in particular, in eastern Ukraine. So, which means again that I don't think there is any scenario in which you can get to a quick ceasefire, any kind of seriously negotiated ceasefire anytime soon. Because first, as I say, you need to be able to help the Ukrainians to stop the Russian advance, and only after that, which will be very difficult, and only after that you can hope to get into a negotiating process.
So, what you're basically saying is that there would be negotiations, but for the US, it would have to come from a position of strength.
I think definitely Trump. That's what Trump would and will try to do. I don't think he wants to be the weaker party in any negotiation. He has been ridiculed for his art of the deal, the book, and he keeps talking about deals and so on. But the other thing that he's always talked about, that he really cares deeply about, is winning and getting so-called good deals. He doesn't want to be the president that will go down in history as the president that lost Ukraine in any kind of objective way. So yes, I don't think he will want to do an obviously unfavorable deal of Ukraine, or to sell it out as some people are concerned.
Yes, in fact, this is what Boris Johnson said, isn't it? We reported a few days ago on comments by Boris Johnson, the former UK Prime Minister, who said that Trump actually could be a lot more robust, quote unquote, with Putin than some people suggest, because prior to that, I think it was on the same day, we ran a story based on comments by Thierry Breton, the former Brussels commissioner, who said that that US aid to Ukraine could dry up overnight in the event of a Trump victory. But that's not your expectation, is it? I'm wondering. You mentioned escalation. What could that mean?
Well, in terms of that would just mean more military aid from the United States to Ukraine. Um, it's a well-known fact, for example, that, and President Zelensky has complained very clearly, publicly about this, that he's not getting even the promised aid. On the back of the Great Congress aid package that was voted back in April. So that was a 60 billion aid package for Ukraine, and it was supposed to equip about 14 new brigades, so 14 brigades worth of equipment. And I think they've received about four, or at least this is what the story is from the Ukrainian side. They need more air defense. They need, more artillery. All the things that are very well known and much talked about, and they're not really getting them. And a President Trump that would want to improve his negotiating position would simply escalate that military assistance. But again, let's not forget that Trump does not actually come into office until January 20th, 2025, next year. So we're still looking at the entirety of November, December, and almost entirety of January. So let's 2.5 months all in all, let's say, roughly, of the war proceeding presumably on the same kind of trajectory as now. And I don't see President Biden, as he still is, making any decisive moves in terms of escalating support for Ukraine in this interval. But in these 2.5 months, the situation in Ukraine on the ground militarily can degrade very much, and it's already snowing in Ukraine and Russia, in that part of the world. The winter has come. It is expected to be a very difficult winter, very, very low temperatures. In the past couple of years, it wasn't that bad, purely from a weather point of view, but this year will be very bad. And Ukraine's energy infrastructure has been degraded significantly by Russian airstrikes. So this will be the most difficult winter even for the population, right? So leaving aside the situation at the front. So in these 2 months, I mean, we'll see what's left of Ukraine's defense on current trends by the time Trump comes into office.
You mentioned that Trump is not expected to make a decisive move, or can't, until next year. But what about Europe then? Is there anything Europe, the EU, can do militarily, politically in that interval?
I'm not sure they can do anything politically. I think, as you've as we all are seeing now, the first reactions after Trump's so-called shock win. I mean, it's a shock only for those who are very dead set against him, who couldn't imagine that he could possibly win. But yeah, others did predict his win. But the reaction now is panic, and the first instinct is to try to be nice to Trump and to try to placate Trump and to, not really make any moves that might look antagonistic. So I don't think, because one option that Europe could have, and people have been talking about it, is to form a so-called coalition of the willing. Get a few states together, UK, France, and maybe Poland, and for example, start giving weapons, giving permission to Ukraine to use long-range UK-made or French-made weapons in Russia without US permission, for example. Or another proposal recently has been for Poland to take over some of the air defense duties over Western Ukraine. So Poland to shoot down Russian missiles that are heading towards targets in Western Ukraine. So that would involve Poland in the war. So all of these are proposals that would break allied NATO unity. So this is what the coalition of the willing, acting without US sanction, with approval, would look like. And this has been the conversation before this election, but I don't think now people will be actually willing to, leaders in Europe, I don't think they will be willing to take that step. I think they will be very cautious. I think, once the panic subsides, they'll take a deep breath and they'll realize that actually Europe is in a much worse situation now on the second coming of Trump than it was in 2016. Europe is on its knees. It can't really play a hard game with America. It's very concerned that Trump will not take America out of NATO, or move towards a so-called dormant NATO. That has been another proposal that did the rounds in the Republican Party some time ago. So fundamentally, Europe realizes, or should realize, that its security is still very much dependent on America. So they will have to fall in line. And the best recommendation for Europe is to simply try to work with Trump, and take heed of some of the things that he's demanding, like increased defense spending and so on. Europe, even if Europe did want to, let's say by a miracle, if Europe decided right now today, if you had a consensus across Europe, including Germany, including France, all these big countries in particular, if you had a consensus for them to put much more money in military aid for Ukraine and take that burden to a completely different level and support Ukraine, they simply do not have the equipment necessary, and the ammunition for it as well. It's just not available now. I mean, the cupboard is empty, in many respects, for many categories of armament. And as I said, there is a time pressure now because the Russians are on the offensive. They're doing very well. I think just today there have been reports from Ukraine, from General Syrskyi, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, saying that, or indicating that Ukraine will start to withdraw from Kursk. Again, it's something that indicates real deep trouble on the Ukrainian side. They need to cut their losses and shorten their front lines, because they're running out of functional fighting formations and so on. So Europe does not have the capacity, in any case, not a ready capacity at the moment to support Ukraine in a decisive way.
So that brings
So
me back to the comments by Thierry Breton. He was talking about strategic autonomy, this idea that if the US withdraws, Europe will have to get its act together. What you're saying is that it's just not realistic, right?
no, it's not realistic. I mean, Europe could not get its act together, even before the war. And I don't think anyone should listen to what Thierry Breton has to say. He has been wrong at every turn. He's been a failure, I think, in his position in the Commission. He hasn't achieved really anything much except more regulation and more, obstacles in the path of European innovation and so on. So I think, Thierry Breton is the last person we should be listening to.
Okay, so let's widen this discussion out a bit then, because obviously there are now reports of North Koreans fighting in Ukraine. Are we seeing an escalation? I actually saw an interview by the BBC correspondent in Moscow and Lukashenko from Belarus. Lukashenko was actually saying that he didn't believe these reports of North Koreans fighting in Russia because it would represent a nasty escalation. Is this what's actually happening?
Well, since I've said that we shouldn't listen to Thierry Breton, I think it's fair to say we shouldn't really listen too much to what Lukashenko has to say. I mean, he also is someone with a long track record of saying all sorts of, um let's say, less than precise and true things. So first of all, with the North Koreans, so the presence of North Korean troops in Russia has been confirmed by the Pentagon as well. This is not rumor; they really are there. It is happening, but they are present so far just on Russian territory. So as far as we know, their mission, the mission of this North Korean contingent, is to fight in Kursk, which is Russian territory. So then the question of to what extent this is an escalation if the North Koreans are actually fighting on purely on Russian territory, that's a slightly more nuanced than saying that the North Koreans are fighting on Ukrainian territory. Of course, others might say that this is just a legalistic distinction and so on. But I think these distinctions are important in war. I don't think any. Um, I don't think any kind of point of no return has been yet crossed as regards the involvement of North Korea in this war. I think, let's see if the Russians and the North Koreans accept the risk of sending North Korean troops beyond the Russian border into Ukraine proper. If that happens, then I think that does become a slightly different question. But for now, we just have limited information, and it's not clear exactly if it is a de-escalation that requires an escalatory spiral on our side as well. And I think that the coming of Trump will could very well reverse even that North Korean involvement. Let's not forget that Trump took historic um, steps to engage with the North Korean regime during his first term in office. And I think he will try to do so again to reconnect with Kim Jong Un and to restore, to take things back, put things back on track in terms of that U.S. North Korean dialogue. And I'm sure that solving the North Korean troop situation in Russia or addressing in some way that issue will be part of the discussions that he will have.
Okay, let's move on to another part of the world, the Middle East. obviously, as far as Europe is concerned, we still have the Houthis shooting at ships in the Red Sea, which is disrupting trade. As I understand it, I've been talking to people over the last week, that situation is actually not getting any better despite the presence of the so-called EU naval force there. What kind of impact could Trump have in the Middle East, do you think?
Well, in the Middle East, Israel is fighting on a seven-front war. Again, a topic I've written about for Brussels Signal. So viewers are encouraged to look at some of those articles a couple of weeks back. Thank you. No, but I'm just referencing them because they give a wider sort of picture and context of the situation than I'm able to do in our short time here. Um, the fundamental problem in the Middle East is Iran. So Iran, obviously, the Houthis are a proxy of Iran. The Houthis are not are a symptom of the Iranian problem. They're not, they're not acting out of their own initiative in this. So, in order to solve the Houthi problem, you need to solve the Iran problem. Well, the Iran problem, is manifests itself on several fronts, as I said, and from Gaza to Lebanon to Syria and in Iraq, the militias there, where Iran has a lot of very important military assets in the region that are ranged against Israel. Now, some of President Trump's greatest achievements in his first term of office in terms of foreign policy have been in the Middle East, the Abraham Accords, for example. And I do expect him to, continue certainly to resume that sort of posture of engaging with the Arab world and the Israelis towards creating that solidifying those bridges, and to try to contain Iran again. So one thing that he did in his first term of office was to reverse the JCPOA, the so-called Iran deal that the Obama administration had signed, and to impose a very, very strict sanctions regime on Iran that was actually working. So by the time Trump was finishing his first term of office, Iran was almost on the brink of economic collapse, and I think it can be, brought back into that very tight corner, which would then give Trump that kind of leverage that I mentioned earlier that he likes to have in negotiating some sort of settlement across the Middle East. Now, I do believe that, as I say, Iran is a very strong priority for not just for Trump himself, but many people in his administration. He's a great supporter of Israel, so that will not be in question. And I think we can expect a very robust U.S. policy towards Iran, in conjunction with Israel, to a degree that hasn't really been possible under a Democrat administration. Because so let's not forget that the Democrats, the Biden regime, which it has been a continuation of the Obama regime. Many of Obama's foreign policy staffers made the transition into Biden's team. So, the Biden regime has effectively continued Obama's policy of, being rather soft on Iran overall. And I think that will all go into reverse, and I think that's the right thing to do. And it should have knock-on effects, positive knock-on effects on Russia as well. Let's not forget that Iran is one of the key backers and helpers of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So put more pressure on Iran, that translates into more pressure on Russia as well. It's a more complicated game there. You have to take into account Turkey's interests. Turkey's moving towards a rapprochement with with Syria, with Assad, and obviously the Russians are very supportive of Assad as well. So this will be a bit of a sort of 4D chess that will start to be played now that Trump, or rather when Trump actually takes office. But I think some initial moves will be made already during the transition. And some signals will be definitely sent during the transition months until up to January. So
Sorry to interrupt, but I want to move on to relations between Washington and Brussels because here in Brussels, as you probably know, the EU institutions are quite vehemently anti Trump, down to a man or a woman. So, how is this going to play out? Everyone's been being nice, at the moment at least, congratulating Trump warmly, quote unquote. But there are concerns, for example, that some EU member states might try to do bilateral deals with Washington and somehow circumvent Brussels. Is this going to happen, in your opinion?
what depends on the area, on the policy area in question. So, for example, on defense, of course, there will be bilateral deals. I mean, there are number of countries in Europe, and not just the UK, but especially in Eastern Europe, Poland, Romania. They have very strong bilateral defense relationships and strategic partnerships with the United States, quite apart from not just from the EU, but from NATO as well. So, for example, there's an entire US airborne brigade deployed in Romania that is not part of, technically, not part of NATO's forward presence, but is just a bilateral US deployment there. So, there are certain areas in which bilateralism will work very well. We know that Trump, true to his art of the deal style and his proclivity for negotiating deals and so on, he prefers to engage bilaterally, and he distrusts multilateral and international institutions. And I think there's good reason for that. So yes, bilateral, diplomatic initiatives. I think, in the context of the end game, if there will be an end game in Ukraine, I think there will be a lot of bilateral diplomatic engagement between the US and different countries in Europe. In terms of the relationship with the EU itself, so with the European Commission, obviously there are some big items on the agenda. The biggest of all is, of course, the trade relationship, and we all know that Trump, compared to his first term in office, now Trump is much more hawkish on trade rather. So he's threatened tariffs, not actually just as a punitive measure, but he's now moved to a position where he believes and he thinks that tariffs will help the U.S. economy to reindustrialize and even allow him to remove income tax altogether.
Yes, I saw that. That's very interesting. It was on the Joe Rogan show, in fact. They were talking about reducing income tax and replacing income tax with tariff income. What do you think to that proposal?
Well, I think it's very interesting. I'm not an economist. I haven't run the numbers. Others have, and I've seen some projections. I think there is a world in which this stuff can add up. Let's not forget the United States is huge. So it's a continent wide market. It's the most advanced and biggest market in the world. I mean, the United States can just trade with itself without having to trade with anyone else in the world, and can thrive just on that basis. The United States has had high tariffs before. So I think it is possible to do that. So income tax doesn't mean that cutting income tax doesn't mean that you cut all tax. So there are other taxes, corporate tax and so on, that will be left. So it's not like removing the entire tax base from the equation by any means. But that's an interesting proposal, and I think it's not, to my knowledge, is not part of the official Republican platform. So he mentioned that in the Joe Rogan show. It's not quite clear if it's actually part of his plans, but I think it's a good indication of the scale of change that might come in terms of policy from a Trump administration that is now prepared to do really big things, to make really big changes to the direction of policy in the United States. Like, and for example, another thing that maybe you've seen this, Justin, but recently a comment from Elon Musk, who I think we all expect will have a big role in over the next 4 years at least under Trump, and maybe directly in his administration. So Elon Musk it was talking about bringing the deficit in the United States down, eliminating the deficit in 2 or 3 years, and coming to a surplus by the end of this new Trump term, which would mean starting to bring down that U.S. national debt. And I think there is clear understanding in the Trump camp that that is a major priority, and so they will try to address that. So it's about tackling these very, very big systemic issues. That's what this administration will be about, and I think they've got now full power to do that, control over the Senate, presidency. Obviously, I haven't seen the results in the House, but I think we should all prepare for very big changes, revolutionary changes. By the way, changes that the rest of the West also needs to consider, for their own polities. So in Europe, in the United Kingdom, we all need to look afresh to these big and chronic problems that we've got. Whether it's the welfare state or immigration or the health service. All these things that are now completely, to a large extent, dysfunctional or bloated and consume a lot of resources. And they're just not operating properly. We're just on a trajectory towards increasing decline, and that can't go on forever. At some point, someone needs to come in and to take the drastic measures. In America, that person is Trump. He will be doing this now. Who will be doing that in Europe?
So finally, then, you mentioned that the US can, to a large extent anyway, trade with itself. But now we seem to be talking about a trade war globally. I imagine if Trump imposes tariffs, Europe would do the same. And then the same applies to China, which is obviously a big player in all this. So a trade war seems inevitable, at least today. And from what you're saying, Europe has more to lose from a trade war than the US, right?
I don't think Europe can afford the trade war. Europe cannot. Yeah, I don't think Europe realizes just how weak its position is in terms of energy security, in terms of defense, in terms of trade. I mean, Europe has done nothing over the past few years at least since the war started, a war which completely collapsed its energy situation, and it's leading to rapid deindustrialization, certainly in places like Germany, as Brussels Signal has been covering and chronicling very well. Um, so Europe is really prostrate, in the face of the current chaos that's engulfing it, both internally and in terms of external threats, Europe is in no position to fight a trade war with Trump. So, but the only and Trump will also press Europe to align with America against China. I mean, that's the other problem that Europe has. Talking about Germany, I've just mentioned Germany. So, German industry is already collapsing, even if they still are, heavily invested in China, and China is their, biggest sort of export market. So if they if they also lose China, if they're being pressed either by the US or maybe as a collateral, falling as a collateral victim to bigger trade wars, a country like Germany will be completely eviscerated economically. So no, Europe is not in a position to play hardball with Trump. What they should be doing, and I hope they will realize this as soon as possible, is to align with Trump and just try to work with him and just respond to the requests that he makes to the largest extent possible. I mean, you either win with Trump or you die alone. I think this will be the story of the next 4 years.
That's great. That's a great way to end it. Many thanks, Gabriel, for coming online with us today.
My pleasure, Justin.
And thanks very much for watching.